Oh, there you are.
Hey,
How's it going?
pretty good. How are you?
You- I'm all right. As you can see, everything's different now.
Oh yeah, how'd the
You
move
can
go?
hear me coming through fine and everything like that.
Yes, I can.
Okay, cool. I got the proposal from you for another lesson at 6 o'clock. Um, was that because you wanted to push this off to 6 o'clock?
Well, no, I was hoping to do like 2 hours.
Oh, okay, that's fine with me. So then let me close this here dashboard and pull up my notes of what we were going to discuss. So, but really quick, how's the semester going for you? I assume you're still taking classes and everything. You're not on a break yet.
Yeah, it's going well. Just took like a pretty serious midterm in like electromagnetics. Um, so hopefully the grades on that are going to be
Oh
good.
wow.
Um, here's to hoping. So
Yeah. I'm hoping as well because I know nothing about electromagnetics. So, all the power to you on that one. Hoping everything works out.
And like, did
Um,
the move go well
so
or?
the move is still in the process. So I have to get my big bed, my dresser, my couch, and stuff like that. I was able to move with my brother some of the smaller things, but it's the larger stuff that like I don't want to break my back over, and I don't want my younger brother to like strain his back on or anything like that. So I'm having a moving company take care of those rather large items. But everything else is pretty much taken care of. My cats are brought with me. They're liking their new home to a small extent, but yeah, it overall wasn't too stressful or anything like that.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Well, if you're ready to dive right back into the discussion, I am.
I'm ready.
All right. So we left off kind of like, going back and forth about this, uh, you know, argument that Karl Marx had in terms of intrinsic value and natural value, and this idea that things are just valuable by their own nature of existing. And then I talked about these like theses on Feuerbach, and then the German ideology, which is one of his like really early big theses that actually wasn't even published during his lifetime. It wasn't fully available like to the English speaking world until the Soviet Union published it in like 1931 or 32 or something like that. But the big point that I want to kind of get through today in thinking about that book is how do we get especially since we're trying to answer this question of like what is communist philosophy and how does communist philosophy relate to the 19th century, the 20th century, and then today, and like what's going on. So in terms of trying to answer that, we have to look at why Marx was trying to be very critical of 19th century philosophy. He was part of this group that I think I mentioned before called the quote unquote. And again, like before, feel free to raise your hand, stop me if you have any questions, anything like that. But yeah, so he was part of this group called the Young Hegelians, a group of students of George Hegel who were critical of Hegel's analysis of Western civilization. They believed that intrinsic value, idealism, and things like that were useful to an extent, but they didn't fully explain the totality of German society at the time. And so they kind of built their whole foundation of criticism by going directly after European society. So basically saying European society sucks, and this is where we're going to begin our whole analysis. And if you read that first chapter from the German ideology, he leans a little bit on an individual named Strauss. He's referring to someone called Leo Strauss, who's like a mid 19th century, also a young Hegelian, but a philosopher who looks at George Hegel as kind of missing the forest for the trees. Hegel likes to describe modernity as like the standard by which all other societies deviate. So if you're either 90% like European society, 50% like European society, or 25%, etc. But only Europe is modern society, according to Hegel. So Leo Strauss is like, I'm pretty sure modernity is a fully made up conceptualization of Europeans. Like it's a label they gave themselves. Kind of like, haha, our badge of honor. we're now in modernity, and everyone else who's not like us, that's their problem. That's so Leo Strauss had an issue with that. He thought that's not necessarily seeing things from an equal perspective, and it's definitely not like putting yourself in other people's shoes. So, in other words, modernity is not a fixed idea. It's something that, first of all, changes from person to person, but it also changes from area to area. People who are in China during, the 19th century don't necessarily look at themselves as unmodern until Europeans start describing what modernity is. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Um, and Strauss also talked about these things called like waves of modernity. So there are people who fall into these two categories. They're either very pro modernity or they're very anti modernity, but there's no like in between. So Marx responds to Strauss by writing this book, The German Ideology, in 1846. And he uses it's hard to like really understand the satire that he uses unless you just are told that it's satirical. But you know what satire is, right?
Hmm.
So like the way Family Guy makes fun of, society and stuff like that. So Marx the way that Marx is writing in that book, if you're reading it carefully, he's satiric mocking European philosophy. So, first of all, he says this big revolution in thought that is brought about by Hegel, the young Hegelians, people like Strauss, it is more significant than the American Revolution, the French Revolution, all these major transformations in society. But he's not being serious. He's being ironic and satirical and basically saying, you know, it's child's play what the French did by murdering their king and overthrowing their society and recreating everything because look, they're still modern. They still haven't changed themselves very much. So he's taking aim at the concept of ideology, which a lot of people have different takes on and a lot of people define for themselves. So I would turn it over to you and like how would you define the word ideology?
Um, I mean, root word in there something about ideals.
So like generally an ideology is built off of certain ideals.
Mhm.
Yeah. Do you think is a religion an ideology?
Um, I don't know if I would say that. I feel like maybe there's some nuance there. There's something I don't know. Like there's some distinction there.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. It's almost as though like it's not just belief.
Mhm.
The ideology that someone has is not just a set of beliefs that they ascribe to. It's also a little bit more about core principles. Like someone's ideology can also include whether or not they are pro or against capital punishment.
Mhm.
Someone's ideology can also include whether they think that religion should be taught in schools.
Mhm.
It can also be a preference of one religious thing over another, such as Catholicism over Protestantism, etc. So ideology is kind of this like weird flux that is not necessarily beliefs, not necessarily motives, but I do agree with you that it is built on a foundation of ideals. I don't like murder. I don't like violations of civil rights. I don't. I do like representation through the state. I do like uh, checks and balances, due process, stuff like that. So it's a combination of things that people do and don't prefer in their general day to day life. So I'm going to read a little bit more specifically off my notes here so that I don't lose track. So Marx takes aim at this concept of ideology, and he called it a, quote, vulgar and fetishized concept of history, one that is grounded in how people think about the past in the present, as opposed to what the facts of the past were. So, uh, to replace this kind of backward thinking as like an assessment of events, an assessment of ideas, and how ideas went from ancient Greece to the Roman Empire, to the Persian Empire, to eventually the Franks, and then the English, etc. He says we need to stop thinking of it in terms of a progression of ideas. It's the materialist conception of history. We need to look at the conditions that have shifted and changed throughout history over time. Now, put very crudely, This suggests that the only real reason that a person is capable of, say, murdering someone is that they have the access and the means to murdering someone. Or another way of putting it is a farmer only grows their crops in coordination with the seasons. They do not try to plant their crops in the fall time, because what would happen if they tried to plant all their crops in the fall time?
It may not end up well.
It would probably just fail. Like
Mm.
they would never grow in the winter and they would never reach the peak. So human beings are kind of like subjected to the conditions that are around them more so than they are subjected to their own ideas. That's the first little point that Marx tries to make in that first chapter there. Now,
Um,
this might seem somewhat dubious. Oh, go ahead.
so a couple questions. Okay, so um, okay, so is it fair to say that the way they were talking about modernity is like a euphemism for like Eurocentrism? Um, and I guess like another question is like, can you say ideology is sort of like synonymous for worldview? Um, and like another question is, I just want to make sure I'm following along. So this, I guess, alternative interpretation of historical progression that's like sort of based around material conditions you mentioned was like a critique or a different perspective contrary to what was the other one?
So at the time, it would be called the idealist conception of history.
Okay.
And you have to think of that as like, so when someone studied ancient Rome in the 1840s, okay, they weren't necessarily trying to understand how did we get from ancient Rome to here. That's usually not what they were doing. They were looking at things like, well, ancient Rome had a political system. And they had a senate. They had, like, in their republic era, they had a senate. Then they had a dictator. They had these identifiable forms that we can relate to today. Because, yeah, certain countries have senates. Certain countries have dictators. Some countries have a judiciary branch that's in control of everything. So they would point out these parallels and they'd say these things are canon to human civilization. You don't go anywhere in modern society and not find these kinds of institutions. Politics always exists as part of the human experience. Economics always exists as part of the human experience. That's usually what historians in the 1840s were doing. They were pointing out the similarities of things. This is actually called cyclical philosophy. And there's a very, very famous statement about history that you've probably heard before that kind of canonizes this whole worldview. Have you ever heard the phrase history repeats itself?
Mm-hmm.
So that comes from Plato. Plato's the first one to say that. And by the 1840s, people are still kind of just replicating that idea that it's the forms of history that are important to look at, not the differences. Like, don't focus on the differences. That's too complicated and too, muddled in individuality. What's more important, these 19th century historians would say, is thinking about history in terms of what is similar across time. Now, your first question, uh, I would definitely agree that by today's standards, we would say the perspective of modernity that Strauss and numerous young Hegelians were pushing is definitely, by today's standards, Eurocentric. That word is more new though, so they wouldn't use that word back then. And I think if we were to like go in a time machine and talk to them and explain to them what Eurocentrism is, they would probably own it. They would be like, "Oh yeah, yeah, we're definitely Eurocentric.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's 100% what we are trying to express."
Mm-hmm.
So whereas we look at Eurocentrism as kind of a bad thing, like uh, a one-sided prism, I guess, they would look at it as, no, this is truth. This is the way that truth exists.
Mm-hmm.
Make sense?
Yeah, and then also, yeah, I could definitely see how the idea of like looking at like political expressions as like coming from a place of like eventualities or something like that could be flawed. But I maybe can also see the appeal because like I don't know, like remove all the technology and sort of like reduce everybody to like sticks and stones, like a Lord of the Flies sort of situation. Um, aren't there some sort of like archetypal, sort of like prototype government structures that begin to emerge? Or
So that's the big divide in idealistic, materialistic philosophy. Karl Marx would say no. And if he were to have read William Golding, I think, who wrote Lord of the Flies, he'd be like, no, that's all horse shit. Like there's no such thing as a fixed human nature. And he would point to things like, look at the ancient Egyptians and their moral and ethical system, and compare that to the Romans, and then compare that to the English and later the British, and then compare that to America today. He would say you will find vastly different conceptualizations of what human nature is in all of those societies. And there would be nothing that's fixed across the board. In other words, I guess he's trying to say, like, the similarities mask the differences, and the differences are more important.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Definitely.
So I make sure that I'm not deviating too much here. Okay, so in building off of all this criticism, and basically saying ideology is a stuck prism that people use, and you also asked if it's a worldview. Yes and no to that. I would say that the way that Marx is using and 19th century philosophers are using the word ideology, I don't think they're talking about a worldview that an individual takes upon themselves and says, like, this is what I think and believe. An ideology to them is like it's in a fixed category. You're either like an Aristotelian, Hegelian idealist, or you're this Marxist materialist, etc. So they would always appeal to like an authority. They would say that your ideology has to be defined by some category of thought or like a school of thought. Whereas I think a worldview, someone could have a worldview today that has nothing to do with a particular school of thought.
Gotcha.
So building off of this, he tries to suggest in the German ideology, where then does ideology come from? Like why do people find the need to build this foundation of ideals? And he says, if you really want a starting point of what we can call history, we need to look at the division of labor, the moment at which human civilization started parceling out, the duties and relegating power to different groups of people. Now, by that he meant, and this is me quoting him, quote, the reason we accept and believe in specific motives and purposes for things in the world is because they are controlled by a division of labor. So note that he is essentially finding his way to assert this labor theory of value over intrinsic and natural value of Aristotle and Hegel. So, for example, we value a very carefully created aqueduct. Okay, it's especially if you look at like the historians of ancient Rome, that's their big, emphasis. Oh my God, the Romans created the aqueduct, and by doing so, they increased the population of Rome tremendously, and then that's what made it possible for them to expand to all these other areas of Italy and eventually the rest of the world. However, an aqueduct still performs the exact same function as a river. It's the distribution of water from point A to point B. What's the difference, in your opinion, between an aqueduct's distribution of water and a river's distribution of water?
Well, doesn't one like imply a certain level of like technological prowess or something?
It does. Like you would have to have achieved a certain level of social development in order to even have the idea planted in your head that, oh yeah, maybe we should construct an aqueduct.
Mm-hmm.
So there would need to be like there's a famous phrase, necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
So they would have needed it in order to like go forward with inventing it.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately they still perform the same function. The difference that Marx would point out here is that a river is not controlled. A river follows the rules of physics and nature. And a river usually flows from like ice sheets or snow capped mountains down to the ocean. So there's a logic to it, but it's more chaotic than it is like building an aqueduct that is very directed by human beings. So an aqueduct flows by the intention of its creator, which is a human. So furthermore, the ongoing insurance that the aqueduct will continue to bring the water from point A to point B is involved in its maintenance, which also involves human labor. So when I teach classes on ancient history, Like we did this earlier in the semester. Um, I always talk about the division of labor because it's one of the easiest ways to kind of jumpstart the discussion of history. But I explain it a little bit different from Marx, and I don't necessarily feel the need to even bring up Marx when I talk about it. And here's how I mention it. This is out of my notes from History 1000. There's not much written record prior to what we call the division of labor. And one of the first primary sources that we have in all of Western civilization is this very old story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Have you ever heard of it?
Yeah.
Have you ever read it?
No.
So, without going into too much detail about it, the Epic of Gilgamesh is basically a story about a king who is put in his place. And at the very beginning of it, he looks at his society and he thinks that, oh, this is all bestowed to me by the gods. Like, and I am a destined king. Like, this is all supposed to happen. But by the end of the story, he realizes no, what the reason why his city is great has nothing to do with the gods. It has to do with the fact that it's run effectively and run properly, and that people are doing what they are supposed to be doing. And like the tax collectors are collecting taxes, the carpenters are building buildings, the infrastructure people are maintaining infrastructure. It's not like people are going at each other's throats and trying to cross over. That chaos is represented by the walls that surround his city. And at the very beginning of the story, he looks at the walls as like, oh, this is what separates us from barbarism. Like we're a civilized people because we live behind these walls. But it's only by the end of the story that he realizes, no, it's the effort of people in my kingdom to maintain these walls that upholds this division between barbarism and civility. So it's not him, it's not the gods, and it's not just the existence of the wall. It's the people of his city all working together to kind of keep this thing alive. This is a very famous story that kind of canonized a lot of early Babylonian religion, which is that hard work is what builds a society. The gods are there, and the gods created the universe, but they're not going to help you out. The god of fire is there to maintain fire. The god of water is there to watch over water. The gods of the heavens and the hells, etc., they're there to maintain those domains, but they're not going to help you get a job. They're not going to help you rule a kingdom. That's on you. So Babylonian religion builds off of that, story, but that's also the first, real written piece of history that we have in all of Western civilization. So after criticizing, all these philosophical schools of thought, and after, pointing the finger at Leo Strauss, Feuerbach, Hegel, and all these other German philosophers, Marx shifts his whole dramatic discussion about the division of labor as Germany enters a revolt in 1848. Have you ever heard of the 1848 revolution in Germany in a
Um,
history class?
no. What were those rulers called? Like Kaisers or something?
Kaiser came afterwards. In 1848, Germany was like a confederation. So,
Mm,
like, there were 39 independent states that were held together loosely by a Confederate constitution. But it's very similar to the American Articles of Confederation, in which it's very difficult to draft up an army. It's very difficult to tax people equally. In fact, some of the areas of Germany are being taxed differently than others, regardless of their wealth, regardless of like property holdings, etc., and religion, regardless of all that sort of stuff. So, like, Germany was chaotically fragmented. And there's also the fact that there's a lot of German people, German speaking people, I should say, in other countries like Switzerland, the Empire of Austria, and certain parts of Poland. So there was this movement in 1847, 1848 called Pan Germanism. And it was this effort like, we should link all of German speaking people together. It sounds a little Hitler esque, I know. I'll explain the differences to it. But the idea was let's unify Germany into one nation state, not have it fragmented and broken apart. Now, what's interesting about this revolt is it caused one of the largest immigration waves to the United States. Um, I'm not sure. I'm sure there are German towns somewhere that you've been to in like the New England area. I know here in Michigan, there's like 4 or 5 towns that I can think of, like Frankenmuth, for example. A lot of tourists go there. It has like all the theme of Germany. All the houses and buildings look like German, buildings from a small town. But that was due to what are called the 48ers, these German revolutionaries who were persecuted by the government during their revolt, but they made their way out to England and then eventually out to the United States. Marx was one of those individuals as well, but he didn't go to the US. He went to England and he just stayed there and for the rest of his life. So as Marx like kind of turns to journalism during this time, and he watches all this like revolt breaking out, and he decides, I'm going to start, writing down and canonizing these events as like the marker at which Germany starts to take a turn towards this modernity that Hegel has been claiming. Now, the only major publication that he made worth note leading up to these revolts is something called The Principles of Communism. And I think it's important to at least address what he was trying to get over or get across in that document in terms of building towards Das Kapital, which is where I really want to kind of get our discussion to. So communism is also the very first, or the principles of communism is the first time that Marx mentions that word in a lot of his works, and he introduced it as, quote, a doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. So Germans like to use the word "of" a lot, so they like to say this is this of this of this of this of this, etc.
Okay, so I just have a few questions. I just want to make
Oh,
sure that I'm
okay, go ahead.
sticking with you. Okay, so these revolutionaries that sort of fled Confederate-stated Germany, they were revolutionaries because they were attempting to unify these states?
Correct.
And
Yeah, there were 2 categories of revolutionaries. The one category was the more radical sect, and they were like the working class group. And I'll get to why they're important. But what's your next question?
And like, what was the sort of like governmental structure that was in place at the time?
So it was kind of like you know what an oligarchy is?
Yeah, so it was a king?
No, that would be a monarchy.
Okay.
So an oligarchy is best described as like a collection of ruling families. So like noble houses. So like the house of this, the house of that, the house of this. That's how the German Confederacy kind of functioned. And no house had say over the others. That was their interpretation of, let's avoid a monarchy, let's avoid a dictatorship. We'll just allow power to be regional based on the lords that are in charge of the land.
Kind of like Russia.
At the time, yes, very much like Russia at the time. Nothing like Russia today, obviously, but I assume that's what you meant.
Well, I mean, from what I understand about Russia today, obviously it's like Putin is in charge, and I don't really know the ins and outs of like Russian like political, everything that they have going on. But I think like just like word of mouth is like before Putin came to power, it was like a bunch of like really rich and powerful people, and then even after Putin started to become more established, there was like this guy who was very rich and powerful who like marched a private army near the capital or something. Do you know what
Boris Yeltsin?
Maybe. And then like he later died mysteriously.
Well, yeah, there are theories as to why he died, but a lot of us think that it was because he was an alcoholic.
Oh. So
he probably killed his liver, but yeah.
Just like the idea that there are like really rich and powerful people in Russia that have their own armies and stuff like that.
Now that's true. I wouldn't describe it as an oligarchy, but I think what you're describing is the way in which, when the Communist Party of Russia collapsed in 1991, there was an effort by the leaders of the Russian military and the remaining leaders of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to try and consolidate as much power as they could, moving into this new phase of Russia. And you have to think of it as like, what happens when any big empire collapses? Do all the ruling families that were like a part of that government just disappear? No. They usually retain some degree of power, but it breaks down to regional power. So yes, in that sense, it's similar to Germany in the 1840s in that it's regional power. If you go to this state of Germany, you have to submit to the rules and the laws of the house that's in charge of that state. But if you go to another one, there might be different rules about what the taxes are, if you can or cannot own property, if you can or cannot vote in assemblies, all that sort of stuff. So that's the difference with Russia. With Russia, after the Soviet Union, they tended to try and make the vote available to as many people as possible. But there was this scramble by certain families and certain former Communist Party leaders to kind of like usurp the vote from specific groups, specific ethnic groups that were living in Russia, because the Soviet Union was filled with numerous ethnicities, like Ukrainians, Latvians, Estonians, Albanians, Czechoslovakians, some Polish, Russians, Uzbekistans. Like there's numerous ethnicities that made up Russia, and they usually were going after that. So in that sense, I get the oligarchy comparison, but in 1848 Germany, everyone's German speaking. And so their oligarchic setup is not necessarily based on an appeal to certain ethnic or geographic groups. It's more of an appeal to, do you live in my territory and are you willing to continue paying the fief so that we don't have to send the military to your house and like arrest you? Mm-hmm. That's kind of how their society was arranged at the time. But there were two big... Oh, go ahead.
So I guess continue off that point. So this was like the milieu that Marx was in when he first started to like use the word communism.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. He was watching two groups take part of this big revolt, and he noted that like one side, there's obviously three people involved in the revolt. There's the state, who's trying to like maintain power. All these houses come together and realize we have to come up with some sort of federated system, otherwise these people are going to overthrow us. It's ultimately a man named Otto von Bismarck that unites all of these confederated territories together. But that's way later. At the time, the revolutionaries were divided into these like liberal groups and then the working class radicals. So the liberal groups favored things that we're quite familiar with today: taxation with representation. I want a parliament. I want a recognition of human rights. I want a recognition of the freedom of religion. I want a recognition of the freedom of press, etc. So that's the liberalism of the 19th century that one group, almost one half of the revolutionaries in Germany, were supporting. But Marx said there's an important distinction between that group and this other group of people who are calling for things like the end of property and universal education and reform of land, so that landlords cannot like build these perpetual slums and keep people in poverty. They had fundamentally different grievances about German society than this liberal camp. And Marx said it's important to note that these liberals are largely like middle-class, well-to-do individuals. Like their lives are not necessarily threatened by the existence of German society. They just don't like German society. So they want to reform it. They want to make it better. But these working class people, the idea of establishing, universal land rights, the idea of establishing laws that perpetuate an end to property ownership, you can't do that with the current state, Marx would point out. They're asking for the overthrow of the government. That's what they're asking for. And they're all working class people. So they have more to gain by revolution than they do reform. But these liberals over here, they have more to gain by reform than they do revolution. That's the big important part about the 1848 revolution that Marx liked to write on. And that's where he starts using this word for the working class called the proletariat, which is actually a French word. But he, in his journalistic, coverage of the revolution, he says it's this proletarian class of individuals who all that they do is sell their labor time. They don't make any money off of like capital investments. They don't own land. They're not involved in the state, in any major way. They are mostly just selling their free time in order to get by. Whereas the liberal group, no, they are kind of in cahoots with the state. Some of them are educators. Some of them are politicians. Some of them are tax collectors. So they have a reason to be part of the existing government. They want to reform it slightly, but not go through this massive overhaul. So, do you have any questions about that before I move on?
No, this is good. I'm with you.
Okay. So, in distinguishing the proletariat as unique to capitalism and not just like the poor. So, a lot of people get confused by that. They say, like, oh, Karl Marx was all about just helping out the poor. And, like, but there's always been poverty. There's no point in trying to end poverty. It's always going to be there, blah, blah, blah. They're missing Marx's point. Marx is saying, like, no, no, no. Of course, there's always been poverty. Of course, there's always been poor people. But the reasons for why people are poor in each successive civilization are different. So let's think of like Greece or ancient Greece. They were largely a slave-built society. But do you know where they got their slaves?
I didn't know that they were largely a slave-based society. I had no idea.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I mean, Plato and Aristotle don't talk about it, but they all owned slaves. Yeah, it was a very heavily dominant slave society. But, you know, where do you think they got their slaves from? Do you think it was like the way it was in the United States and that they defined people based on the color of their skin?
Um, I mean, is this maybe where we get into like maybe like indentured servitude, or maybe like you sell your rights or something to become a slave to pay off a debt or something?
That can happen in certain instances, but indentured servitude, I would also argue, is more unique to like the 1600s and 1700s. So going all the way back to Greece, it was a matter of war. You know, Athens would go to war against Sparta, and they would, like the Peloponnesian War, and they would go to war for 10 years. All during this time, there would be numerous battles, and a lot of battles in which they took captives back. It was those war captives who were turned into slaves. Now, that is fundamentally different from chattel slavery in the United States, and it's also fundamentally different from the way in which indentured servitude operated. Indentured servitude in like the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries was, I don't have enough money to pay to get out to those colonies, so I'm going to sign a document that basically signs over 10 years of my life, and at the end of which I will receive a plot of land, and I will probably receive a slave or another indentured servant, something like that. So each condition of servitude is somewhat different and unique from one civilization to the other. So I'm actually happy that you brought up indentured servitude, because that helps explain this whole, you know, difference between civilized groups. Did you have another question?
Nope.
Oh, okay, sorry. So for modern capitalism, and trying to understand what is this proletarian group, how are they oppressed, and how is this all related to intrinsic value and my desire to break down European philosophy, Marx points to the Industrial Revolution of the 1700s in England. And, you know, he says this flows over into Europe, into France, Switzerland, Germany, Spain, Italy, etc. And it also flows over into the American economy eventually by the 1810s, 1820s, and 30s. Now, since I'm more of an American historian than I am like a world historian, I actually like to use the American system as a great example of how these systems transition into one another. So I assume that you're aware of the kind of general American history, and that after 1810, the northern states and the southern states began to distance themselves politically on the basis of slavery.
Yeah, we touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, okay. So in the North, there was like an increased demand to buy all of our goods. And we were producing a lot of goods that, you know, the world wanted. A lot of people think the United States is like this beacon of capitalism, but we actually started as a very agrarian, agricultural-driven economy. It was tobacco, it was, well, eventually cotton, but also hemp, corn, indigo, sugar, stuff like that. So that was what was driving the economy, and that's also why a lot of you know, early presidents were, you know, favoring tariffs, because we were exporting so much stuff that we might as well make money off of it if we're going to export all this stuff out. So a kind of bottleneck started to occur in the 1820s, and the bottleneck had to do with slavery in the South. In the North, They mechanized their agricultural systems. They started buying the means of building like mechanized tractors. They started building factories. They started paving roads so that it was quicker to transport things from one part of the economy to the ports and stuff like that. They started building railroads that like linked all the way out to the Ohio Valley and then went straight to Boston, went straight to New York City, etc., stuff like that. In fact, I wish I had it. I probably could have scanned it and prepped it for today, but there's a great map from the history book that I use where they show in 1820, you could start to see how many roads and canals are built all throughout the United States. And in the North, it's like innumerable. Like there's so many roads, so many canals being built. But in the South, it's like one road going from, Omaha to to New Orleans, one road going to Tampa, one road going to Atlanta. Now, there's a fundamental reason for this, but can you guess why?
Um, they just like relied too much on slave labor. They didn't really have a good reason to innovate. Maybe.
That's basically 90% of the answer. Yes. In the North, in order to build roads like that, in order to build canals, you need a lot of people. You need more people than you have slaves for in the South. Because if you start taking slaves off the plantations and having them build roads, what happens to all the crops that are being made on the plantations? That's going to have a huge detrimental issue. So northern merchants would go down to the South occasionally and they'd say, hey, how about you just hire us? We'll come down. We'll bring a bunch of workers from the north. We'll build all these roads. We'll build all these canals, and we'll help further integrate you into the world economy. Southern governments were like, hell no. No way do we want wage earning workers like existing side by side with our slaves. No. Especially when they find out that a lot of the individuals who were willing to take on these wage jobs were immigrants or African Americans or people who were not white in some sort of a way. So Southerners wholly rejected this whole mechanization of agriculture, this increased infrastructure building. They were like, no, 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 this does not serve our interests. Like this will fundamentally start to break down slavery. So we don't want anything to do with it. And as a result, by 1850, 1860, when the Civil War breaks out, the North is mass producing goods and they're bottlenecked by the limited production of goods from the South. They need the cotton that's produced to make the linens and the clothing up north. They need the tobacco to roll into cigarettes up north and sell on the global market. But they're limited in that production when it's stuck on slavery. So Karl Marx actually notices all this in the 1840s and the 1850s. And this is why he wrote a bunch of letters to Lincoln in the 1860s, basically arguing, look, you have to kill slavery. Like you're never going to have a functioning national economy with this wage labor system in the North and this slave labor system in the South. They're incompatible systems. One of them has to eat the other. So the big argument that Marx makes here is that you don't get capitalism without the death of the former system before it. So capitalism out of the Industrial Revolution emerges because it killed feudalism. It destroyed the means for feudalism to continue existing. Nobody wanted to be a serf anymore when they could go own property and they could just make money for themselves by owning property. So that is the general crux that he's making in this observation between the German Revolution of 1848 into the 1850s is production modes and production systems build themselves off of the death of the previous system that existed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do have some questions.
Okay, sure, shoot.
Oh my god. Okay. The term Slav, I assume, means slave. I know we were talking about slaves in like Greece a second ago. I wanted to ask about where the term Slav came from, or like who the Slavs were enslaved to. Another question is like, why was slavery so valuable to certain Southern actors as to like put off like industrialization or like technological improvement? And then like another question I feel like is a little bit like, I don't know, like conspiratorial, I guess. I mean, Like there is like talk or murmurings that like the quote unquote elite want to continue to squeeze as much energy out of the working class as possible until we end up at a place of like feudalism, neo feudalism. But if you have already communicated that, like, well, I'm not sure if you've necessarily communicated this, but if you have said that feudalism ultimately is not conducive to like a thriving economy, is that sort of conspiracy theory really true or tenable? So yeah, those are the questions.
Good questions. So the Slav question, that actually comes way back from Charlemagne and the Franks. Have you ever heard of Charlemagne before?
Yes, yes.
He united the Franks and created the basis of France
Hmm.
and the French monarchy. And just like Napoleon, he marched his way all across Europe and conquered a lot of territory. And in the process, absorbed a lot of Russian, Slavic speaking peoples. And then he labeled them as like, these are going to be our peasants. These are going to be the people who are going to do all the mass growing of agriculture for us. And that's where the pejorative term Slav comes from. Yeah,
Wow.
largely. There's other uses of it, but that's how I've been taught. Is it largely comes from Charlemagne. Um, Now, before the conspiratorial question, you had another one. What was the second question?
Why would the South like reject technological innovation in favor of like keeping slavery? Like,
Oh, my the short answer is racism.
really?
Uh, I mean, I would lean on Angela Davis here, because I'm a huge fan of her works. Angela Davis does a great job at breaking down how racism we think of today as racism as like going against the grain, like you're causing problems for people, so you're bad, you're violating their rights, you're treating them inappropriately, you're disenfranchising them, you're removing their voice. That's how we think of it. Angela Davis, who is a Marxist, argued that racism was very valuable and very profitable in the era of American chattel slavery. Like it kind of reminds me, I always mention it in class, even though it's very hyperbolic. Have you ever seen the movie Django Unchained?
Yeah, yeah, I have.
So that's a great movie. It is hyperbolic. It definitely dives into hyperbole, and it's very idealistic in its portrayal of chattel slavery. But Quentin Tarantino does get across the point that a lot of what was going on in the maintenance of the Southern economy was built off of the genuine idea that white people are superior to all non-whites. And you see that in the secession statements of states during the Civil War. Alexander Stephens, who was the vice president of the Confederacy, when he was doing his acceptance speech, he said, "We are engaging in this battle to uphold that noble truth that the white man is superior to the Negro."
I have another question. Can I ask another question?
Yeah, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Um, at what point does I don't know if this was like Darwin or if this came like if this came after Darwin, but like at what point do people sort of realize that generally all humans evolved like from someplace in Africa and like all ancestors were like some shade of brown, and like how does that like mesh with like racism? You know what I mean? Like, I don't understand how you. I don't. You know what I mean? But
No, I get what you're asking. Anthropologists have been arguing the origins of the human species into Africa, especially like the areas of like Ethiopia and the mountains that are south of Egypt, probably since like the 1790s. But in the 1790s and all throughout the 19th century, it all remained like a theory. Like they didn't have the evidence to prove it. We have since definitively proven the origins of the human race. Um, and we especially now know about the Bering Strait and Beringia. Have you ever heard of that before?
heard of it. Not super familiar.
It's a land bridge that existed between Alaska and Russia, and that's how Native Americans, well, we call them in history the Paleo Indians,
Mm-hmm.
because they came from India and then they made their way into the Americas across that strait. And if you were to add, and here's the other more important thing that anthropologists figured out, is they know why human beings left Africa.
Hmm.
Like there was a moment at which we had an ice age and it covered the entire earth, like top to bottom, and then the equator was basically the only livable place for human beings. But then that ice age ended and it slowly receded the ice caps back to the poles. Now, an interesting thing happened. Human beings were hunting animals and they were feeding off of the berries and the nuts and things that they could find in that habitable area. Well, as the ice sheet begins to pull back, the animals that lived in that area follow the ice sheet because they're like, this is where all the fresh water and fresh grass and stuff is. And then the human beings, they're like, well, we're not going to stay here in this now emerging desert. We're going to go follow the animals and we're going to keep migrating our way. So that's what caused human beings to spread up into Europe and into Asia. And then when they found the Bering Strait, that was like the last point of the ice age where there was still enough of a glacier for people to cross over into the Americas. And so that is largely, and I think it was maybe the 1950s, 1960s where this becomes like a very solid, no longer a theory, it's a hypothesis of science, in which if you disagree and you think that there's an alternative, show us your evidence, show us your proof. And that still is largely the case today. But to answer your question, why do people, sometimes deviate from this, even though we know what science says? I wouldn't say that's necessarily just like racism or something like that. I would say, religion is a huge component there. Our culture and the Christian theological, Judeo-Christian religions, and even Islam, they do not depict Earth as being possibly that old. Anthropologists look at this and say this happened 10.9 million years ago. Well, the Bible and the Quran say that the Earth is roughly 10,170 something years old. So how can that be true? So there's ideology again. There's people taking core beliefs and foundations and kind of placing them in front of what their eyes, their ears, and their relationships with other people tell them. But going back to the question about like why did people resist mechanization of agriculture? The reason why I say racism is because the landowners of the South were enjoying white supremacy. Like black people could not vote, they could not own property, they could not leave the slave plantation, and even if they were lucky to leave and become like a fugitive slave, they had a fugitive slave law by 1850 that forced northern states to bring them back down to the South. So, even northern states had an issue of racism. They didn't want African Americans coming up to the north, and we know that for a fact because when the Great Migration happens during World War I, the Ku Klux Klan starts popping up in the North, where it's like they never existed in the North before. Why are all these white supremacists now showing up in northern states like Michigan, Ohio, New York, Maine, etc.? It's because there still is. There was and still is a general crux of racism in American culture. It's not something that I think we're going to get over anytime soon.
Is it like a naive or sort of childish question to ask, like the origins of racism or where that comes from or why it persists? I feel like, it's like, okay, so you're like, I don't know, like you're some sort of like European or something, and you're like exploring the world for the first time. Well, I don't know, because like they knew about Africa, but I guess I want to say like you explore, you find this new land, and you discover these like creatures that are sort of like human, and maybe they speak a different language than you, so maybe you assume they're a different species. I don't really know, but I just feel like you could approach that from at least a place of neutrality, where it's like I don't really know what these creatures, people are, but like how does that neutrality evolve into something sort of uglier, where like we're gonna like, I don't know, mistreat these creatures? I don't know. It's like I have a lot of, I don't know. You know what I mean?
So when I was in graduate school, I took history of the Civil War with the African American professor at Wayne State, Kadada Williams. And she, on the very first day, she asked us all. She was like, "Okay, what do you think came first in human civilization? Was it racism or is it slavery? What do you think? How would you answer that question?
Which one came first in human history?
Yeah.
Probably slavery.
Yeah, you'd be correct.
Yeah.
But why? Why didn't racism come first? How do we explain racism based on that answer?
I mean, because I just assume, like, you know, you go to war and you have like you capture and you have like war prisoners and you force them to do your labor or whatever, but there's still like an understanding that, like, they're not lower than you, they're just from a defeated, well, okay, I don't know, well, if they're defeated maybe they are lower than you, I don't know, I mean, I'm just.
So let me give you an example. Okay, Rome decides it's going to go invade northern Africa, or what? Let me start with another example. Rome decides it's going to go invade Sicily. A
Mm,
bunch of Latin-speaking people
mm,
who also are white, or they're the same color as Italians from the boot. Now, Sicily loses that war, and they absorb a lot of those war captives and make them into slaves.
mm,
And a lot of them become incorporated into Roman society as slaves. Then Rome goes to Carthage, which is in northern Africa. And they have a lot of Arabs, they have Africans, and they have white people who have moved from Europe down into northern Africa. When Rome goes and conquers those people and absorbs them into their slavery system, do you think that those slaves with different religions, different ethnicities, I don't know why this is, yeah, I want to stay on the page, different religions, different ethnicities, different political systems, do you think Rome treated those slaves the same as the slaves they absorbed from Sicily, who spoke the same language, had the same culture, had the same religion, and looked the same as them?
okay, I
The
think
answer is no. They definitely treated the Carthaginians worse than they treated the Sicilians.
so you're saying like racism has its origins in like xenophobia.
Yeah, I mean, she described it, Dr. Williams described it as like tribalism.
Ah,
She
okay.
said it's an element of tribalism that lingers on in human civilization.
Yeah.
And in that way, it's very difficult to combat. Because if you were to go right up to a white supremacist, if you were to go right up to like David Duke, the former head of the Ku Klux Klan, and you were to ask him, like, why are you a racist? He wouldn't he wouldn't even try to like disown the idea. He would try to convince you of racism.
Hmm.
He would try to convince you that he's right and that white supremacy is justified and makes sense and is logical. So the Romans would do the exact same thing. And if they were to explain to you, why do we treat the Carthaginians different from the Sicilians? Because the Sicilians speak Latin. That's why.
Hmm.
It's very similar once we jump forward in the timeline up to when Great Britain, Portugal, and Spain are all trying to go out and explore the world. Portugal makes their way out to Japan.
Right.
And when they land on the Japanese islands, do you think they look at the Japanese as their equals?
Hmm. Yeah.
Not at all. They look at them as like, who is this like barely feudal tribalist group of families that are just like, they don't even have guns. They're just like invading each other and chopping each other up with swords. They looked at them as complete
Hmm.
barbarians. And I think in that TV show, Shogun, they even do a good job at showing how like the English and Portuguese merchants who show up, they just call all the Japanese people barbarians. They're like all
Hmm.
these barbarous people, blah 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 blah. It's also replicated when you see English and Spanish explorers show up onto the islands of Hawaii. They've experienced the exact same thing. They're like, well, these people are capable of trading with us, but we're definitely not going to ever consider them equal with us. And if we go to war with them and we take those islands, they're going to be a second class citizenship
Oh my God.
in terms of how we see it.
When do you think this stuff goes away? Like.
I mean, that's that's the question as to I think why people still study things like Marxism and communism, because Marxism as an ideology and a even a worldview, it is an attempt to like where is it? I had it up here. Um, he describes communism. It is a quote doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. So I think the reason why Marxism remains popular, even though communism as a political system has failed numerous times, people still rally to Marxist thought because it is this doctrine of perhaps there is an answer, perhaps there is an end to these social divisions embedded in this philosophy somewhere.
So it is accurate to say that communism has been tried and it's failed, because I know people will say like, oh, communism has never been tried or something like that.
Oh, yeah, it's very fair to say that. I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed.
Hmm.
It's hard to argue that communism succeeded in Russia when it was both the very first communist nation to ever exist and it also completely succumbed to financial default. It could not survive of trying to do what it claimed it was doing, providing universal health care, making sure everyone was fed, making sure everyone had a house. Homelessness did not exist in the Soviet Union. But if you look at the bankrolls of the USSR by the 1980s, they were completely bankrupt. They were incapable of paying their politicians, the salaries that they were guaranteed to. That's a large reason as to why people took part in those revolts of 1989 to 1991. It was this idea that to hell with your ideology, we need to eat. Like we need things to keep us going by. So yeah, communism definitely failed in certain instances, but I would not say that communism as an ideology has failed absolutely. China, still a very powerful communist country. Vietnam, still also a very profitable communist country. North Korea, I would argue, is not necessarily communist in the way that Marx and Lenin looked at it, um, but does operate with similar conditions to that of China. But Cuba is also a good example of a nation that, despite all of the criticisms that we can lay upon Cuba, I think it was just within the last 8 or 9 years or something, like Cuba discovered the most recent cure for cancer. So, communist countries do things that are highly productive and they are highly integrated into the global economy today. I mean, China technically owns most of the United States' debt. And if they were to call in that debt, and we would be the ones to default like the Soviet Union. So
Um, and
it's
just
both accurate and inaccurate.
and I guess like one last question before I let you just I'm sorry, just um I don't know, it's like maybe like a conspiratorial question again, but like um to what degree can we say certain like communist or like very socialist flavored or oriented countries in Latin America have failed because of the ideology or because of like interference from like the West or like coups and like sorry, like bad actors funded by the West and things like that?
That's an excellent question, and I think the answer is both. I think that for one, and this is just me talking. This is not me trying to like say this is what Marx thought or this is what a lot of Marxists today think, etc. This is just me. I think that a lot of people, a whole lot of people, including the big names like Lenin, Mao, Stalin, Kim Jong Un, etc. I think a lot of them do not fully understand historical materialism and the idea of how a propertyless, classless society is built. I think that all of them are guilty of succumbing to like this idea of I'm going to take nationalism first and then communism second. Like security of the nation state is priority number one. And if that means ending the ideology of communism, so be it. Like a lot of people look at socialism with Chinese characteristics, the transition of Mao's thought of communism into like Xi's perspective of communism today. They look at that. Some people look at it as like, China became capitalist. Whereas other people look at it as like, well, they evolved their thinking about what communism is in a modern society.
Hmm.
So but at the same time, that doesn't mean that communism as an ideology is solely to blame. Because, yes, the United States from 1944 all the way up to the present has been consistently involved in trying to check and challenge the power of revolutionary governments. I mean, the Bay of Pigs. We tried to invade Cuba. We were involved in Angola. We were involved in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in Chile, and we assassinated the leader of the Congo. And we helped depose the dictator of Egypt when he made it very clear that he was going to make an alliance with the Soviet Union. So, yes, the West has most certainly been involved in breaking down the effectiveness of communist governments. But, it's one of those kind of dualities of history in that it's not just one group or one person to blame. It's kind of like it's a dialectic. It's multiple things coming together, bouncing back, and the responses that people have to things. I mean, even if you look at the Cold War, Stalin, for example, when he sees that the United States is going to chuck a bunch of money at Greece because it's succumbing to a communist revolution in 1947, Stalin basically throws a bunch of resources down at Greece and then engages in the Berlin blockade. He orders Berlin to be locked down. No one can come in or out. And the United States has to respond with an airlift. They have to bring food and supplies and try to keep the people of Berlin alive. Ask yourself, what the hell does preventing people from getting food and resources have to do with communist ideology? What was Stalin doing there?
No
Does
idea.
that have to do? Yeah. So Stalin was being a nationalist. He was concerned about his nation state far more than he was concerned about convincing the people of Berlin that communism is a good idea.
Hmm.
So I'd say that's the fault there. The United States is involved, yes, but were the responses by communist governments the best and most effective decisions that could be for their people? I personally would argue no.
Hmm.
So it's kind of a two-way street. I also wouldn't say that's necessarily a conspiracy because, again, we have definitive examples of both of it happening. Like Stalin is a great example of him not thinking at all about communist principles when acting as a politician. And then the United States engaging in the Bay of Pigs to stop the Cuban Revolution is a great example of us trying to interfere ourselves with other governments. Make sense?
Yeah, it's just a lot of things that I did not know about. A lot of things I have to do some homework on. But wow, yeah, I'm with you.
Now, there was another conspiratorial question that you had, but it's escaped me now.
Talking about well, like the idea of like the elite or like rich people sort of continuing to take more and more from the working class and like, quote unquote like push us towards like feudalism, neo feudalism, but like
Oh yeah, the neo feudalism. Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
I mean, I wouldn't say that's conspiratorial. I'd say that's a pretty logical assessment by people who are operating on this idealist conception of history. Remember how before I said that like the historians of the 1840s would constantly be like, what's most important are the similarities across history, not the differences. Don't look at the differences.
hmm.
The people who say that we're degenerating into neo feudalism are doing the exact same thing. They're not trying to describe a new form of capitalism. They're not trying to describe capitalism evolving and adapting with the changes of history. They're trying to say like, oh, it's very similar to feudalism, so we're just going to call it neo feudalism.
Hmm.
I think that's personally a cop out. I think that they are copping themselves out of trying to provide a more concrete material analysis of what is different about this kind of neo feudalism from capitalism and from actual feudalism.
Well,
Make sense?
I think like another term I've heard is like technocracy.
And then that's probably a better term because it suggests that technology is fundamentally a component here.
Hmm.
So I kind of like that word. I would say that that's probably accurate, but is it destroying class relations or is it maintaining them?
Oh, that's
Is
a.
it breaking down the relationships that separate us or is it upholding them in some sort of a way?
I don't know if I can answer that question.
Well, we might be able to get to that once we start talking about the ways in which human beings relate under production between their use value and their exchange values. Um, so I think where I left off before I started talking about or started answering your questions is looking at the origins of capitalism and how American slavery is a good example of this like transition of one system into another off the death of the former system. So there was the German revolutions of 1848. And after that happened, he wrote this piece called Wage, Labor, and Capital. And he said that the price of something, and he was definitely speaking to that working class of Germany at the time. He said the price of something is not just the result of supply and demand. Like, we sometimes think that supply and demand is the sole determinant of what gives something value, like a loaf of bread. He says, actually, there are competition among sellers. Yes, that's what supply and demand is a representative barometer of. But there's also competition among buyers, and there's also competition between the buyers and the sellers themselves. The competition between the sellers, like Ford Motor Company and GM, is largely financial. They're competing against each other to maximize the profit that they get out of their entire enterprise. The competition between the buyers, however, the people who want to buy their cars, is a little bit more concrete. They have to compete by selling their labor time. The financial transaction does not involve any sort of like expenditure of labor and effort or time. It's more of like, am I able to put as much money into this system and net 50% out of it profit versus them putting Y amount into it and netting 25% profit. That's the goal of the sellers, is to make sure that they're constantly selling more than their competition. But the buyers aren't necessarily in that kind of competition, right? Like, when we go to the market, like, I'm in competition to maybe get the bread off the shelf, but I'm not in competition with all the other buyers in the grocery store in terms of like, I'm going to take that bread and then go to the front store and then I'm going to haggle for it. Like, if they really want it, I'm going to offer $2 more. Nobody does that in the supermarket, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So by giving up our free time, our leisure time, we all recognize that, when we go into a supermarket to buy groceries, we're all kind of sacrificing the same thing. We're all kind of equals in that sense. Thus, Marx concludes, quote, "The determination of price is tantamount to the labor time requisite to the production of the commodity. The cost thus consists of raw materials that are needed to make something. 2, wear and tear. I have to pay at some point for the wear and tear of my factory or the tools that are involved. I also need to pay for the tools, thus, so there's the third element. And then there's labor. I need to pay people to do these other things." It didn't take very long for Marx to realize that if you remove labor from this equation, what happens?
Everything else becomes more expensive, maybe?
Everything else kind of becomes irrelevant. You can have all the raw materials. You can have all the means of paying for the wear and tear and the maintenance of your factory, and you can have all the tools necessary to build a bunch of cars in your factory. But if you don't have any workers who are willing to work that factory for you, you're not gonna make any profit.
Right.
You see what I mean there? So the Communist Manifesto, probably one of Marx's most famous works, was written looking at it from that perspective. And he writes it in a manner that is very simply worded. He's trying to speak to those working class Germans that are in revolt. And he's trying to speak to them in a language that does not sound like, I'm this high-flying academic and you need to listen to me about like how you should be running things. He's not trying to do that. He's trying to talk in very simplistic terms. And he says history is divided into epochs. You have slavery, feudalism, mercantilism, and capitalism. And then eventually you're going to have communism. And each epoch is also divided into rulers and oppressed. But the rules by which the oppression occurs shifts from one society to the next. And upon the new society, the way in which it is built is that people become conscious of the fact that they have more to gain by engaging in revolt than they have otherwise in upholding the system. That's what Marx calls class consciousness. Mm-hmm. The point at which we realize, why the fuck am I paying this much taxes for something when I don't even have any representation of the government? He would look at the American Revolution and he would say people like Patrick Henry, the guy who said, give me liberty or give me death, George Washington, James Madison, all these revolutionaries who challenged Great Britain. The reason why they did so is because they were landowners, they were slave owners, and they had the most to gain by engaging in a revolt against Great Britain. They were class conscious, not the slaves, not the masses of people working the ports of Boston or slowly building the roads, etc. Those people were incapable of manifesting a massive revolt. But the landowners, when they realized that they weren't given representation in government, they were being taxed differently from the landowners in Great Britain, and the idea of quote unquote rights in the colonies versus rights in England, the second that the founding fathers realized that that was not accommodating for them, they said, fuck it, we're going to declare independence. So it's this consciousness, this awareness that hits people eventually living under a system of oppression. And so the Communist Manifesto is very short because it's just trying to make a very simple point. You need to become aware that you're being oppressed in this society, and you have everything to gain by revolting against it. That's where we get the phrase at the very end of it, quote unquote, the workers have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win by engaging in this revolution.
Um. Well, I mean, they could possibly like lose their lives or like sustain injury.
Yeah, they could. That's true. I think, it's funny that you say that, because I don't really know how Marx would have responded to that. He does talk about violence and death as being a fundamental component of human existence, but he doesn't necessarily describe it as a component of human civilization. So there's like, maybe it's a little bit like that tribalism aspect. Like, there's human beings, and then there's the society that human beings live in. Usually people ascribe society to be better than the individual, because the individual will murder and kill and do anything that they want in order to survive, right? Well, society is supposed to be like this social contract in which we don't murder each other just because we want to survive. We don't cheat each other. We don't steal from each other. A lot of it is derived from like religious canon and the idea of like, how do we create a moral and ethical society? But nevertheless, we usually do place society above the needs of the individual, because the individual has that capacity for like, breaking against norms. But yeah, you are right. You could lose your life by engaging in the revolution. But I think, even if we like think of the American founding fathers example, Patrick Henry most certainly knew that in writing "Give me liberty or give me death," that he might be killed for it. But do you think he cared?
I guess he was just at a point where he didn't care anymore. Maybe.
I mean, what's the title of the document is "Give me liberty or give me death."
Hmm.
Like, you might as well kill me if you think that I don't deserve freedom.
Hmm.
So I do think that, you're right, but those individuals are willing to take that gamble.
Hmm.
And I think Marx is trying to encourage people to take that gamble. Like,
Hmm.
you have a lot to gain by taking this risk. It is a risk, it's a big risk. And let me turn this light on here because I realize it's getting dark for me. Okay. But nevertheless, it's a risk that you should be taking. Make sense?
Yeah. Okay. 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 So that earlier point that you made, as far as like the founding fathers gaining class consciousness, um, first because, how do I put this? Like, oh my god, it's like they had like the means to rebel, or like they had land and property and they had slaves and all these different things. They were like a little bit higher than the slaves. They were like a little bit higher than poor people, and that they were able to like arrive at class consciousness before. Is that what you're saying?
Kind of. I wouldn't say that they were a little bit above slaves. They were very much above slaves.
Mm.
And that's an important component here. So, someone like Patrick Henry, who grew tobacco, that's all that he did. He grew a bunch of tobacco. He was more wealthy than members of parliament in Great Britain.
Mm, yeah.
He had more social, economic, and political power in the colonies than a lot of politicians in Great Britain had. I would argue he probably had more power out here in the colonies than the monarch of England did, because at that point, by 1750, the monarch has been disposed of their like absolute control. Parliament is what's making the laws at that point. Um, And yeah, he probably realized that. He probably realized if I were to sell all of my assets here in the colonies and move back to England, I would see a huge drop down in my overall standard of living.
Hmm.
Why the hell would I ever submit to a system like that?
So it's in the state's best interest to try to court the wealthy.
In a sense, yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, the revolution certainly profited off of that because you can't perform a war against the world's largest power, Great Britain, unless you have the economic means of paying for it.
Hmm.
Like that's what Great Britain, I don't think, realized until it was too late about the American situation. Is they were like, oh, how dare these colonists like challenge us? We'll just send a fleet over there, and we'll knock them around and put them back into order. Well, we were also producing all of their tobacco, we were producing all of their sugar, and our entire economy was based off of slavery at that point. So what are they going to do? They're going to blockade us. Okay, they're going to stop us from getting European goods. Fine, we'll start making our own goods. Like the American economy was so powerful at that point, you can't cut us off and make us sweat. It's not going to happen. The economy will survive as a result of it being so self dependent. We were not dependent on Great Britain at that point.
And then you went and you said Marx would try to encourage people to sort of take that risk, and to like, you know, arrive at class consciousness. Um, is there any room to like uh, arrive at class consciousness or like change society significantly in a way that's pacifist, or is that like ridiculous or?
No, I mean, it's not ridiculous to have an idea like that. What would be ridiculous, I think, following this discussion is what is your means of doing it? Like, how are you going to create a pacifist society that is rational and in the means that does not just replace the system with another oppressive system?
Yeah. Hmm.
I think that's the big thing that Marx was trying to explain with the Communist Manifesto is that look, all these other previous societies that went from slavery to feudalism to mercantilism to capitalism, they didn't understand this concept of class. They didn't understand this historical materialist conception of history. But we do. We understand it. And that's why we will build a society that does not repeat the failures of the past. Now, we could sit here and go back and forth probably all the rest of the night as to whether or not Marx was right about that. But that is the point he was trying to make, is that we are aware of the way the history works better than those previous societies, and as a result, whatever we create, this future communist socialist society, it will invariably be informed by that idea of class consciousness. Make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
So here's kind of this is where we get into Marx's magnum opus, Das Kapital. And I think that after we kind of wrap up the discussion on Das Kapital, it should be clear where this communist philosophy kind of has semblance for the 20th century and the 21st century. Um, Karl Marx's book Das Kapital is by far his most important piece that he's ever written. And that's not just because it's like a foundation text for Marxism. It is a canon example of trying to write history through this lens of materialism, not idealism. Let's talk about history as it is, as opposed to like what the gods think it might be or what religion says history might be. It is an attempt to explain capitalist society through almost a scientific like lens, if that makes sense. And it's also his big effort to finally say, aha, I found the way to prove that intrinsic value is bullshit and that the labor theory of value is the reason why oppression exists in our society. So uh, it's usually, this is just what I had for my notes here. It's usually considered his most important work because, oh yeah, it's also emblematic of a more mature Marx. So whereas if you remember earlier, I said Marx used like satire and the Communist Manifesto purposefully like avoided high flying abstract language, etc. You know, Das Kapital is not like that. He does not try to make jokes. He does not try to jab at people. He tries to write it almost like it's like a scientific research paper. And he's trying to be as serious as possible. So a lot of people consider this to be like the point at which Marx matured and he really reached like a full understanding of what he was